The event is part of a series about aspects of Magna Carta 2020, and we'll tell you a little bit more about others at the end of this event. Before we start, just a few housekeeping announcements. Could you please stay muted unless you are asked to put your question? And could you please keep your videos off? Now, I do encourage you to ask questions and to make comments, and to do so in the chat function as soon as they occur to you. We will then take questions and comments after the third of the presentations. And so to our topic, academic freedom, roots and realities. It's a huge topic, and it's centrally important for higher education. It's one of the fundamental elements of the Magna Carta Universitatem 1988 and again 2020. It's central for us in higher education for challenging and for developing our understanding across all subject areas. Much is written about academic freedom. Many conferences are held about it and webinars. But a recent survey showed that only 25% of academic staff were aware of their university's policies on academic freedom. It should be a straightforward concept, but it's very culturally contextual. Also, in many countries, governments are seeking to control or moderate it, for example, by issuing guidelines, as are other bodies in society. And there's a question, to what extent can academic freedom be defined and protected in law, which is what some countries are trying to do. Within universities, there are concerns about the need for safe spaces and calls for no platforming, but also concerns that that would affect the dialogue necessary for understanding our world. Now, these issues raise all sorts of challenges for those responsible for running our universities, for academic staff, for researchers, and for students. Academic freedom has to serve a social good. It is a freedom to be used responsibly. But what constitutes irresponsible use? So, what are we to do? Today, we want this webinar to help our understanding by looking at the roots of academic freedom, and then looking at how these grow up into practice. To help us, we have Professor Julius Weinberg, formerly Vice-Chancellor of the University of Kingston, London. We have Professor Maria Kronfeldner of the Department of Philosophy of the Central European University, sorry. But to start, we have Milika Popovic, who is coordinator of the Global Observatory on Academic Freedom, who is going to look at the roots of academic freedom. Milika, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for the lovely introduction. And also thank you very much for inviting me to present the observatory and our work. It's been lovely to actually have a chance to speak to the community of Magna Carta Observatory, I think for the first time since 2007, when it was the first time that I went to Bologna. So it's really an honor to be among all of you today. I'm going to have a very brief introduction. First of all, trying to explain what is this observatory. And this is the Open Society University Network initiative called Global Observatory on Academic Freedom, hosted currently at the Central European University in Vienna. We have existed for about a year, since last March, and we really tried to focus on connecting scholars with expertise and interest in academic freedom through organization of a number of events, and of course, fully supported by our very highly acknowledged advisory board, creating a space for debate and discussion on the concepts and challenges to academic freedom, but also trying to publish high quality research publications on academic freedom. And for the last year, we have commissioned a publication on academic freedom in Hungary. We have published a research on the relationship between quality assurance and fundamental values in the European higher education area, a study that has been commissioned by the Council of Europe. And we have prepared the global report, which I will be in a way presenting today. So looking at first, what we wanted to achieve with the global report, our first global report of the observatory, we really wanted to look on these changing understandings of academic freedom in what we call the world at a time of pandemic, since our temporal focus has been the years 2020 and 2021. And we wanted to keep some of the key basic tenets that we have adopted in our work, and that is having a fully global approach to understanding academic freedom, having a multi-level approach, and going beyond cases and numbers. There are brilliant colleagues who have already done an immense amount of work in cataloging infringements and attacks on academic freedom. We have colleagues who have developed the Academic Freedom Index, quantifying the approach to academic freedom. And we wanted to provide something a little bit different, all the while staying a certain hub for connecting academic research on academic freedom, but also policy development and advocacy. Of course, at the core of our approach also stands this continuous encompassing reflection on this relationship between academic freedom and democracy, and understanding whether it is even possible to reflect upon academic freedom in non-democratic environments. And when we discussed how are we going to go around this presentation of the report, which has just been published and is in the process of final layout for full ICBN publication, but it can already be accessed as PDF draft on our website. I thought about 9 key observations, which truly kind of highlight what we have concluded from this initial comprehensive research of what has happened with the understanding of academic freedom in the last 2 years. And since the title of this webinar is Roots and Realities, my immediate thought was that there is a certain tension between roots and realities, and what is necessarily perceived as the key root for understanding academic freedom does not necessarily reflect what happens at the level of the institutions. So the first, of course, question of a possible tension, seeing the developments of higher education in the last decades that we are all very much aware of, concerning the commodification and massification of higher education, which have been followed with continuous precarization of scholars, and all the while trying to understand academic freedom at the core of the search for truth and knowledge as a public good. as part of the academic endeavor that we are all implied into. And understanding the tension between institutional autonomy and academic freedom really stands at the very basis of even kind of trying to understand why is academic freedom a special right, so to say, or a specific individual value that we want to identify here. But also looking at the developments of how academic freedom has been codified, how it has been legislated throughout the years. Of course, the focus of the subjects of bearing the right to academic freedom have always been the academic staff. And in the most well-known documents that we're going to look into, also very often, even the contractual and non-tenured academic staff have been encompassed as bearers of academic freedom. Yet the students have very often been left out from the understanding of subjects of academic freedom, and even more so unaffiliated scholars. And if we want to understand academic freedom in the complexity of the ever-changing panorama of higher education today, we need to ask the question, how do we tackle academic freedom for scholars who are not affiliated, which today, especially for the early career researchers, becomes a reality more and more often and for longer and longer periods of time. And then, of course, the second question that we need to ask is, we might have noticed, as many also researchers or report authors have noticed, that there is a lack of one single universal global framework on academic freedom. And that is indeed true. But if we look here, since 1940, there has been a development of a number of documents at a global scale, national scale, transnational, international scale, which have been trying to somehow codify the issue of academic freedom. So we can ask, is there truly a lack of a global framework, or actually a lack of implementation of the existing instruments on academic freedom? And of course, given the fact that all these international documents which exist have not been legally binding for the member states which have been adhering to them, thus this was translated into the fact that there is a lack of monitoring mechanisms, a lack of complaint mechanisms to which one can turn to in cases of infringement upon academic freedom, with the exception, of course, of CERT committee, which reflects upon the ILO UNESCO 1997 recommendation being the most widely used one. But the committee for ILO UNESCO recommendation does meet only every third year. And we are all very much aware that infringements and the crisis in which academic freedom is being attacked happen in a much more volatile and actually at a much quicker pace. So it has become a case for courts, and in many instances, it has been the judiciary proceedings that have been addressing the complaints in cases of attacks on academic freedom, most notably the European Court of Human Rights. And also very recently, we've had this kind of truly important case and verdict by the European Court of Justice, exactly in the case when the European Commission has submitted a demand against the government of Hungary in the case of expulsion of the Central European University, or in the case of United States of America, where actually the judiciary proceedings have largely been addressed through the First Amendment of the US Constitution. So the courts have been addressing the attacks on academic freedom, all the while also opening this tension and this question upon us to reflect whether we perceive academic freedom as another human right, or is it a special right in itself that needs to be approached from a different kind of perspective. And as Professor Liviu Matei has already been setting up a thesis that we are currently faced as a crisis of academic freedom in the world, or at least within Europe. Looking at the developments within the last 2 years, which have been actually numerous in the field of academic freedom, and most notably in attempts to regulate and codify academic freedom, we can ask the question, is there a crisis, or is there a certain revival of attention being given to the issue of academic freedom? And of course, many of these documents, which all of you are much aware of, has also included the revised Magna Carta Universitatum in 2020. And trying to understand what have been these movements in the developments of codification, the most numerous ones that we could have seen, and so to say the strongest movement that has been noticed has been within the European higher education area. Of course, the academic freedom has been one of the core tenets and values of the European higher education area since its inception and development by the Bologna Declaration in 1999. But it has slowly developed throughout the ministerial communiques. And finally, by the Statement on Academic Freedom at the ministerial meeting in Rome 2020, fully defined as a freedom of academic staff and students to engage in research, teaching, learning, and communication in and with society without interference nor fear of reprisal. And in parallel to these developments within the European higher education area, on the European continent, the European research area has also advanced in its attempts to define and codify academic freedom through actually making the synergy of the definition of the Rome Statement on Academic Freedom and opening this further importance of trust in science in a democratic society, but also opening up the issue of the relevance of internationalization as one of the many facets of these new developments that we have been facing in the last decades of higher education and its relevance for academic freedom as well. Since we are limited in time, I will just briefly mention that, of course, all of these European efforts have been strongly supported also by the efforts of Council of Europe, which have been developed a number of recommendations, resolutions, and reports in the field of academic freedom in the last couple of years. So kind of completing the picture in these European attempts to codify the understanding of academic freedom. And of course, trying to understand what is happening, we've seen these codifying efforts on the European continent, but we can ask the question, is this really just a phenomenon happening within Europe, or does it have a much global, wider outlook? So we looked in other places where in the last 2 years, people have been trying to understand, explain, analyze certain trends in academic freedom. And there has been a number of reports which have been published, which have looked in various aspects of academic freedom, which have been mostly focused either on attacks, as I have in the beginning mentioned, scholars at risk, documenting a number of attacks and infringements of academic freedom, the perceptions of scholars themselves. David has mentioned that there is a lack of understanding by scholars that has been noticed in their own perception of what academic freedom is and how they can actually exercise their right of academic freedom, and also a number of reports trying to understand very specific individual country institutions. But we can ask ourselves, are these reports in a way uncovering a number of phenomena that have until now been marginalized, or do they serve in a sense as a magnifying glass by just bringing attention to academic freedom, giving us the perception that there has been indeed a rise in attacks on academic freedom? And what has been a very interesting development is that there have been a number of human rights organizations which started to deal more intensively with the question of academic freedom, and which have even started to propose certain model codes of conduct and guidelines for higher education institutions on how to approach their own protection of of academic freedom. There has been a mapping of support programs, especially in Europe, for scholars at risk, very much needed today in the present context, which have also outlined a number of discrepancies of what these support programs have been providing and what are truly the needs of scholars at risk. And last but definitely not the least, in the group of the reports which have been looking really into the perceptions of scholars themselves on the understanding of academic freedom, I wanted to highlight one coming from Singapore, which has shown us a very interesting finding, because the usual understanding would be that actually the tenure status or rank of academics shows different kind of vulnerability towards the attacks on academic freedom. But the report from Academia Singapore has shown that more than the tenure status or the rank, it's actually the gender aspect and citizen status that makes scholars more vulnerable towards the attacks. And the everlasting question, can we measure by quantitative terms academic freedom, or is this indeed a value which needs to be approached in all monitoring mechanisms through a more qualitative, soft approach of understanding? And one of the biggest achievements in the last few years has certainly been the publication of the Academic Freedom Index that I am certain everybody in the audience is well acquainted with. And then, of course, it's the question of who codifies academic freedom. And we could have seen a stronger movement within various governments in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, being at the forefront of codification and regulation of academic freedom, which has often been actually criticized by the academic communities on one side by not being sufficiently involved in the processes of codification, but also on the other side that these attempts of so-called protection of academic freedom by the governments are actually very often hiding exactly the opposite, the attacks on academic freedom by the governments who are trying to push for stronger regulation of academic freedom, especially in the case of the UK, where actually the new code has been majoritarily criticized by the unions and scholar community as another way to circumvent and limit academic freedoms in the UK. And there's, of course, always the question, at which level do we try to protect academic freedom? We could have seen the level of nation states where there remains a strong tension between the academic communities and the governments. But there has been also a very novel development in 2020. For the first time in history, there has been published a United Nations report on academic freedom and the freedom of opinion and expression by a special rapporteur, reasserting that the perception of academic freedom and attempt to conceptualize remains understanding it as a right and a value in the same facet that the European higher education area actually has been trying to do. So throughout all these developments, which really have been numerous in the last 2 years, we can openly ask the question why there is such a need to push forward for a codification and regulation of academic freedom. Is this indeed an honest response to the rising crisis of academic freedom in the world? And what is actually the reality on the very ground within the higher education institutions and among academic communities themselves, which my colleagues will be opening furthermore in the discussion later throughout the webinar. Thank you very much. And let's continue, David.
Well, thank you, Malika. That was a really tough task. The amount that you included in that was amazing, and you timed it to the minute. So that is, we admire you for doing that. But let's sort of grow from the roots now into the reality. And let's go first to Julius. formerly Vice-Chancellor of Kingston University, London. Julius.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Mincha. It's a difficult act, as David says, to follow. So I'm going to speak from the position of someone who ran a higher educational institution, was regularly asked to stop things or do things because of academic freedom, and was criticised by David Cameron, then Prime Minister of the UK, now disappeared, no one knows where, for getting it wrong. I'm not sure about academic freedom. I'm sure about the right to freedom and expression, but I'm not sure there should be a special carve-out for academics, and I think that's something perhaps we can discuss later on. I also just want to acknowledge right at the beginning that this discussion probably feels very different in those countries where there is not broad-based freedom of expression and where there might be some protection within the walls of the academy. So remember that I'm talking from the perspective of somewhere where pretty much there's broad-based freedom of expression, and I recognize those differences. So why should there be academic freedom? I'm going to go back a little bit further than Militia, and I think J.S. Mill kicked the ball off really when J.S. Mill commented that truth arises from the clash of disagreement in liberty. I can't remember the exact words. And then that was picked up by J.H. Newman in What is a University in the 1850s, where he said, a university is pledged to admit without fear, without prejudice, without compromise, all views, if they were in the cause of truth. So they're basically both saying the same thing, that disagreement generates truth. So I follow up from that by saying that actually, and I think Milish touched on this, that actually academic freedom is not an absolute right or an absolute good. It is a process which leads to what she called knowledge as a public good. So I think that helps us a bit. So it says, yeah, academic freedom is a good thing, but it's to develop this thing called knowledge as a public good. So maybe there are times when academic freedom actually prevents knowledge as a public good, in which case then why would one want academic freedom? So maybe I'll develop that a little bit further. And I think it's easiest to develop these through some real cases. So what do you do if you're running an institution about the biomedical scientist or the doctor who is proposing some bizarre treatment for COVID or some bizarre etiology for HIV and claims academic freedom as their right to continue doing so, and in the process damage, possibly kill people, and damage the reputation of your institution, and as a result damage the future of academics? Oh, you come from that place where that nutter says X, Y, or Z. Oh, you were a student of that person, don't want to employ you. What do you do there? Where are the limits to academic freedom? We are deeply, as academics and societies, influenced by two myths. One I'll call the light bulb myth, that out there, the everlasting perfect light bulb has been invented but been suppressed. And the other one is what I call the Galileo myth, that out there is the lone brilliant scientist speaking out against the world. Now, occasionally it is the Galileo, but 999 times out of 1,000, that one lone person is wrong and possibly mad. And then thirdly, we have what's called balance. So although 999 people hold one point of view, if one person holds the other, we have to have balance in public discourse. We saw that clearly over climate change. So what would you do about the rogue scientist? Or maybe not rogue, but as an institutional leader, what would you do there? Secondly, what do you do about the part of your university that claims academic and religious freedom to have someone to speak in a closed space. And this is where I got criticized by David Cameron, where our Islamic Society were asking someone who the government considered a hate preacher, although there was no evidence that they were, to speak at a closed meeting. But actually what I did was to say, this is not academic. Closed meetings aren't academic. Let's go back to Mill. Let's go back to Newman. It's about the clash of ideas. Ideas in isolation are nothing to do with academic freedom. But if your speaker is willing to come and speak to a public meeting where they can be questioned, then that's academic. So actually what we ended up with was a hate speaker having to stand up in front of an audience which included the LGBT society and others who could question them openly, exactly what a university should be about. Even so, I and a couple of other vice-chancellors who have done similar things were criticized. Now, I think that is where, as institutions, we should be managing what we do to promote the beneficial outcomes of academic freedom. And so continuing with that theme about managing academic freedom, I'll go on to an area where I have changed my mind, largely under the influence partly of my own children, but of their peers and friends when they were students. Safe spaces. David mentioned safe spaces. Should we have safe spaces? I used to think that safe spaces were nonsense and that universities should be anything but safe. However, the university is very much based on a privileged middle-class idea, where students come from environments where they've been used to rich discussions with a variety of topics. Our students now are very different, especially in those universities which are not the privileged elite. Again, as Manicha pointed out, massification has changed the student body. Many of the students at my university, which was 50% first generation, many of them came from narrow backgrounds, had not had to cope with the sort of rich combative discussion that I was used to and many of you will be used to. They did need safe spaces, but in the words of that advert, a safe space is not just for Christmas. A safe space should only be provided by the university as a safe space to move out of, to become confident, to become able to engage in the robust world of controversy and debate for truth-seeking, not a safe space forever. I think we make the mistake of providing safe spaces without actively managing what I think is a fundamental part of the education of many of our students. And finally, I just want to comment on the fact that all this hinges on the fact that if academics and academic institutions are to demand a special carve-out, it's because they're claiming to have some knowledge, something special that they can contribute to the debate that produces public knowledge, which is, as Mitchell pointed out, a good. If they don't have that knowledge, then they have no right to the claim. And again, many of the rather difficult discussions about academic freedom turn on events where people are actually commenting outside their domain of knowledge. A social scientist getting involved in genetic debates about the bell curve, something they have no special knowledge about. They're just being the bore on the bus. They should not have any claim, I think, to academic freedom just because they are an academic. It is not the freedom of the academic person. It is the freedom of academia, of the academic as an institution or a body of knowledge. So I think we need to think very carefully about the demands to produce a carve-out, and then think, as well as about academic freedom, about what the limits to academic freedom should be if we're really to think about the benefits of public knowledge. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Julius. Some very central questions there, which I hope we will return to shortly. But let's move now to a current researcher right in the thick of all this. Maria, over to you.
Thanks for having me. I have a small little presentation which I try to share. So I hope you can see that. All right. So the question is, I need to adapt something. Good. So where's the line between legitimate critique and infringing academic freedom? That's what I want to address. Because that is one of the realities that I face as a researcher, in the sense that there is a crisis, in my view, also within, or at least it's an alleged crisis that people talk about and struggle with, sometimes at least, about members of the academic community infringing each other's freedom, also known as cancel culture or no platforming or silencing. And that is a matter of the details, the dirty details, so to say, of applying the received concept or principle of academic freedom, the implementation, as Milica has called it, or practice. Now, I do think that is important, maybe because of many things, but also since the principle of academic freedom can also be abused, and that was mentioned by Julius as well, for hiding behind academic freedom. So it does occur, at least that is my experience, that a legitimate and justified critique of someone is strategically taken as an infringement of academic freedom. And that is what I call an abuse of the principle. A related issue is not so much related to critique, but to ignoring somebody or not staging somebody's work as infringing somebody's academic freedom, which is slightly different. And I will ignore it for today for the sake of brevity. So here's an assumption that I will make in the following. There's no time to really defend it, but I hope that it's convincing. Not all critique is a restriction of freedom, of expression or academic freedom. So one may think that goes without saying, yet we are living in a time of polarization, as part of which participants of controversies about freedom of expression, or then narrower viewed academic freedom, seem to dispute exactly this claim. So parts of the so-called safe space movement seem to take any kind of criticism as offensive or discriminating and as undermining their freedom of expression, for instance, regarding their identity. And I say parts. I don't want to criticize as a general claim the safe space movement, not at all. I'm actually aiming to defend certain aspects of it. Now, their opponents also evaluate any kind of criticism they receive as a restriction of their freedom of expression, for instance, regarding their political views. Now, what I do want to say is that both if you regard any kind of criticism as offensive, or if you regard any kind of criticism as taking away your freedom of expression, then these are just two sides of the same coin, and both are questionable because of that assumption. Now, if that is right, the task ultimately is, and I think, I'm not sure, I at least don't have the answer, so this is more of a kind of a work in progress task, what I think we need to keep in mind and need to accomplish in the future, is first negatively viewed, that we are not equating critique with the restriction of freedom, and are not assuming that it never happens that a critique actually restricts the freedom of those involved. So it needs to be an open question. And positively viewed, I'm a philosopher, so I like normative questions, and they're difficult, but nonetheless they are important. We need to give an account of how critique should be like, normatively viewed, so that it does not limit the freedom of the criticized person. Now, in principle, what counts, so this is the start of an answer, leaving out a lot of the complexity involved, but I hope it helps us for the purpose today. In principle, what counts as a legitimate criticism rather than a restriction of academic freedom is determined by the disciplinary quality standards for adequate scholarly work. And I think Julius and I agree on that. So I take some of his comments to basically confirm that statement that I just made. And I want to add that because there are people saying, yeah, but that's so difficult. And I say, well, yeah, sure, it's difficult. No one has promised that it's easy. Scholarly life is difficult. And as we can assess whether something is an adequate scholarly work with respect to dissertations, right, daily work for us, we should be able to assess it in cases of no platforming controversies. Whether a speaker, Julius' last point, has a claim to knowledge, is going beyond that realm of expertise of that person, or even making confusing scholarly work and political work. So if we can't assess that systematically, if we fail to do that, the crisis is deeper, much deeper. So then we're not just talking about a crisis of academic freedom. In practice, whether a specific criticism is argumentative or not, and as such an argumentative critique adequate, legitimate, given the respective standards for an academic work, can only be decided by looking at the argumentation. It almost follows kind of analytically from, because it's about argumentation about knowledge claims. But also, and that is a point maybe strong or controversial here, that you need to factor in the epistemic goals involved in practice. It cannot, controversy about no platforming, for instance, the invitation of a COVID denier, let's say, or a climate denialist, it cannot be decided by looking at the person, except the expertise point that we have to assess the person's expertise. It cannot be solved by just looking at the topic. It's a sensitive topic, for instance, the claims themselves, because you need to look at the argumentation, whether that is really scholarly, or the sheer fact of protest. Some get afraid if there are people protesting against a lecture planned, then they might just react to that, or the format of the protest. So I do side with Militzer, who mentioned, I think without using the word power, that there are power relations in the academy, in academia, and if someone distributes flyers versus has the power of the lectern, that shouldn't make a difference to our decision of whether the critique raised from the lectern or from the flyers is appropriate or not. Now, epistemic goals. And then I show you examples why I think that helps. Academically justified critique, rather than infringing someone's freedom, asks, what is the specific epistemic goal associated with an invitation to an event or with a publication that is getting very controversial? Here are some goals: to clarify and discuss arguments for specific claims, to present empirical evidence about certain facts, to allow insight into certain experiences of people, be they politicians, activists, citizens, etc., to advocate a certain political attitude or stance, to provoke controversy for the sake of controversy, etc. That's an open list, but I think it has quite some important ones. And now, one of the claims I make here today is where to draw the line. You see it there. To advocate a certain political attitude or stance is not the aim, the goal of the university, which is about furthering knowledge. Another point where I want to second what Julius said. And to provoke controversy for the sake of controversy is neither. And here now I show you two examples where, following these kind of recommendations or kind of principles and aspects that you should focus on the argumentation and on the epistemic goals helped in two controversies of no platforming in which I was involved, and I'll stop in a minute. In one occasion, and I keep them anonymous, also which topic was at issue, the criticized had to admit that the goal of the controversial invitation was provocation. So in the discussions about that other people in the university said, you can't invite that person, then in the end, the person admitted that the point was to show that universities are ruled by left-minded liberals that infringe academic freedom if it doesn't go for, or if the people don't share the political views. The point was a self-fulfilling prophecy to steer controversy, not any epistemic goal. The second case I was involved as a faculty which was successful by staying with the arguments and the epistemic goals, was that the criticized had to admit that his controversial claims were based on feelings and experiences rather than arguments, and the criticized was unable to provide arguments on stage. So the event happened, but those who are criticized that the event should happen were really questioning and staying at the level of argumentation, and the criticized one had to give in. So these are successful examples, and I hope they can encourage all of us that it doesn't have to end up in a scandal, or that there is room for legitimate critique, that one doesn't have to silence oneself or others by following a really scholarly mechanism or scheme. Thank you very much for your attention.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. All three of you have done a remarkable job in very concisely putting some quite complicated issues. There are some comments and questions coming in through the chat, but I'd like to take moderator's privilege of starting with one which is related directly to the Magna Carta 2020. One of the key differences between Magna Carta 2020 and the 1988 version is that it makes it much clearer how, or the ways in which universities might serve societies. And if I think back to my time as a university registrar, the issues which I tended to have put before me regarding academic freedom were where the politics of the faculty was seen to be interfering with their academic professionalism. And Maria just asked the question, you know, where do you draw the line on all of this? So it seems to me we have a tension. Universities serving society, members of university, faculty, being sometimes politically active, and maybe parties outside the university being unable to distinguish the two. I mean, what are your thoughts about how universities or faculties or members of faculty might be clearer and might set out more clearly the distinction between those two things? Would one of you like to come back on that?
Shall I have a go, first of all, David? I'm not sure I can. It actually links, I think, a little bit to the question about from Saturday Shami about the Wendy Brown about complexity of campuses. And so I'm going to wrap this. One that's you clearly haven't been to many UK campuses if you think that all campuses have lovely public squares. Many of them don't. But I think there are a couple of issues for me. I think the university has a very important place in society as a neutral space for discussion. And we're losing many of those. So here's an example. When I was Vice-Chancellor at Kingston, there had been a rather unpleasant event of racial tension mixed with some religious tension within the local community. And a number of people tried to broker discussions. The one place that all the participants felt they could come to speak and talk to each other was in the university, because they all recognized that we were a neutral space for exploring ideas. And symbols are important in life. Alicia and Maria and David and I discussed this a little bit beforehand, but symbols matter. So I think there is a symbolic space for the university as a place for the courteous exchange of ideas with knowledge underpinning them. And I think we have to be very careful if we do anything that damages that, because then society as a whole loses. It loses a powerful resource. So that, I think, means that academics have to be very careful when they are speaking personally. And we're all people. We all have batty emotional ideas which lie outside our areas of expertise. But we should be very careful about when we're talking outside our, and that's especially true for senior academics who get invited onto television programs or invited to talk about something, and then they find they're commenting outside their area of expertise. So I think that whether we're speaking on behalf of our emotional selves, our rational selves, or our institutional selves, each of those matters. And we have to be much clearer about stating that. And then the final thing I just want to say is I think we haven't mentioned it, though it's a spectre in the background, the whole problem of identity politics, or identity here, where our identity is so closely wrapped with an ideological point of view that an attack on the ideology is felt as an attack on the person. And I think that underpins, Maria, some of the issues that Maria was talking about. We can rationally say, yes, this is not just controversy for controversy's sake, but some people will feel, yes, it is, because I so absolutely know this position, because that's what I am, that you're just mouthing off for controversy's sake. So that may look right rationally, but it's quite difficult again to implement. And again, running a university where there are people who came from quite narrow social backgrounds with very, very strong socio-political ideas, who had never really been exposed to anything else. They weren't trying to be destructive or unpleasant, but they found it quite difficult to engage in the sort of discourse the middle classes would view as quite normative. So that's a very long answer, David, to your question. But I think it's clear that from the university point of view, it's differentiating me as an emotional, rational, and institutional individual.
Yeah. It's not a straightforward question, so the length is entirely justified. Maria, did you want to come back?
There's not much for me to add now. I agree, and the one thing that I might add is that faculty, and I don't want to talk about faculty. I talked in the presentation from my perspective of experiences I had, which could be helpful as examples. But I want to talk about the scholarly community, the individuals, including the students, the untenured faculties, the scholars who don't have a position at university. So for someone like me, it's always the scholarly community that matters, and most at least. And so it is still a widespread assumption that we serve society, right? That's our duty. That's why we get paid. That's why we have all the kinds of liberties. We have plenty of liberties that we get, therefore, to do our work. And some philosophers of science, which is my area of expertise, call that kind of nexus between the science and the society that or higher education and science and humanities, or that scholarly, the academia, is serving society, that interconnected picture as one where it's well ordered. So there is a ruling coming from the society, also with respect to the topics that are significant and important. So Philip Kitcher, for instance, has called that model the well-ordered science model. And and the ordering of the academia does come from value influences of a society, and where there is a connection. Now, that does not and should not mean that as a scholar, I'm becoming an advocate of a certain political opinion. We lose a richness, we lose an option where I can really stay a scholar rather than becoming an advocate. So I am someone speaking up for engaged philosophy, for instance, which is what I'm doing, right? Not just like all kinds of problems that are irrelevant for society, even though everyone should have the liberty of researching whatever you want. But I would always oppose a model where I'm not a scholarly engaged person, you know? And basically, unfortunately, it's still the position, siding with Julius, that we have since, I think, defended since 100 years, and Weber defined it as the value-free ideal of the university. I should always make it clear when I'm speaking as a scholar, or when I stop the sentence and now I'm speaking as an advocate or a citizen or someone who has interests, economic interests, maybe even, etc. No one can only try. One may fail, but one has to try.
Thank you very much.
If I may.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe looking from a somewhat different point of view, because I think, David, you've raised this immensely important question, also how the environment for higher education institutions has been changing, with putting more emphasis on the question of serving societies. And we have already opened also the issue that, of course, academic freedom as such is not only a right, it's also a responsibility. But the way that, of course, as much as we can try of making it clear, when do we speak as scholars, when do we speak as individuals, I think everybody who has ever had any relationship with media might not have always found themselves in their words being fully transferred accordingly to what they have said. So this is somewhat, of course, the responsibility of the scholars, but does not always transpire as such. But my question is, being a political scientist and political sociologist is also the concept of politics. I would not necessarily take emotions out of knowledge, and I would not necessarily take political out of the quest for knowledge. There is, of course, a huge difference between partisan advocacy and partisan advancement, but there is an open question whether, as we might know, in a way, personal is political, and that also means professional is political, and already everyday decisions that we make in our methodological choices, in our topical choices, already reflect a certain politics or certain social frameworks where we come from. And that's where actually this question also comes of seeing scholars as public intellectuals in their role of responsibility towards society, where, for example, it might be more or it might be much easier for a physicist to say, well, you know, I've spoken about this topic until now as a scholar, and now as an advocate, I will start discussing the a specific, I don't know, conflict, for example. But my question was always, and a dilemma, especially in social sciences, where I truly believe in the necessity also in transdisciplinary approaches, or as a political scientist, where does my expertise in political science ends? Certainly there are certain areas of focus and so to say, larger and in-depth knowledge. But being a political scientist or a sociologist, we can raise the question, where is this limit of where we are not anymore speaking from a position? So I do think that there is a very practical problematic of, you know, this kind of fluency between these lines and borders. And I'm not necessarily convinced that we need to be so strict in imposing them, because I think that's exactly one part of the responsibility of university for scholars having undergone this training, having received the privileged of being in a position of creating power and knowledge, and we know they do come together, in also kind of expanding and exchanging widely. So this is, yeah, I think it remains an open question in a certain way.
Thank you. I don't know whether we've got any representatives of student unions on this call, but one of the things that I used to enjoy was dealing with these sorts of issues with students' unions that wanted to be active in society and active based on what they were studying. I mean, if there are any, please do contribute to the chat, and we may turn around to pick this up again later on. But I'd like to go now to a question, Julius, which relates to something which you said. Melanie has said, I find this notion that academic freedom is only for within your area of expertise intriguing. I remember an argument that it's actually more important for areas outside of their expertise, for instance, punishment of a professor by the university for expressed political views on social media unrelated to their experience. Would this be viewed outside the bounds of academic freedom protection? What do you think, Julius?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I don't know the particular case, but I will consider this. So what is it that someone is contributing outside their area of expertise that means they should have special consideration as against other members of society? For example, why don't we have plumbers' freedom? Why aren't plumbers given a carve out to say whatever they want about something they know nothing about? Why don't we have footballers' freedom? I'm being deliberately provocative here. So, okay, I'm a physician by background. Doctors think they know a lot, but why should I be allowed to expound about art history? Well, actually, I happen to have an art history degree as well, so maybe I should. But what the point I'm making is, what is it that's special about academics that should allow them to contribute outside an area of acknowledged expertise? And I think Melissa just touched on this now, that there may be a claim that because we're academics, we have some specific way of understanding how knowledge is formed, how to form an argument. But then lawyers could claim something similar. So generally, I think there's a good principle here that if the purpose of academic freedom is the generation of knowledge as a public good, and maybe we should argue that's how some people might think that's not it. But if it's the generation of public knowledge is the generation of knowledge is a public good, and it's an area of which I have no knowledge, then I'm not doing anything to develop public good. So why should I have a carve out? So moving on to a professor that comments on social media in an area unrelated to expert, they should have the same rights as everyone else. I'm not saying academics should have fewer rights to comment outside their area of expertise and they should shut up. But they should say, yes, okay, I'm a senior lecturer, I'm a professor, so I have some degree of status in the world and maybe some knowledge, but this is not my area of expertise. I think honesty is important. Otherwise, I think what you have is an academic using that title and the symbols associated with it dishonestly to push a particular point of view. I'm an academic and therefore I must know something about this. Actually, my area of expertise is Slavonic languages, but I want to comment on the educational attainments of Blacks in the US. Nonsense.
Thanks for that. Now, Maria, you gave some thought to where was the line. What are your thoughts on this question?
So I side with Julian on that particular case, and I'd repeat my line that I would add, so to say, that one can not just add, it's not my area of expertise, but I want to say something on it nonetheless. One can add, I'm speaking as a citizen, right? I can say it isn't so difficult to bring the personal in, just make it explicit. Transparency of these kinds of value influences and political roles that one might play as an intellectual, as an advocate, you know, all these concepts, like Milica mentioned, the intellectual as a figure in our society. We need to understand these figures and distinguish them, and they're all valuable. It's not just the academic, the scholar, but mixing them up completely and not distinguishing them is a loss. That's what I would add, and maybe that the person not making it transparent that the person speaks outside of its political realm is actually making a political statement as a citizen, is actually abusing not just like the symbolism and that Julius mentioned, but the power of the lectern, that I'm having that role, I'm having that title of being a professor, I'm having that audience, and I shouldn't abuse that role, but it is a power, right?
Yeah. And
that is what I take as a responsibility, Milica, because you defended, so to say, that values should have an influence, they should, but in specific ways, and in other ways not. There are beneficial influences of values, and there are those that stifle the kind of specific nature that the scholarly realm offers as one that is then open.
I want to stay with power for a minute, because I think our next questioner has probably given us a topic for an entire webinar, but let's pick it up. And it's the question, how do you differentiate power from expertise in the academy? In the academy, we assume that you can acquire standing and power. In the institution, you acquire expertise. All right. Now, if we just think outside for a little bit, what are the reasons why society might be concerned about academic freedom and try to limit it? And I guess some of those relate to the fact that it might come through and manifest itself in power in ways that are seen as inappropriate. But that's probably only half of it. I mean, what are your thoughts about how we differentiate between power and expertise?
I think if you want to track expertise, you assess the arguments and the way, as you assess a dissertation, as I said in my presentation, it's always the same kind of scholarly assessment. And that the two are distinct is clear, because you can have expertise without power. So a good PhD student might have a lot of expertise, but not yet power within the academic world, at least not as much as then you have like increasing power up to rectors and whatever, board of trustees, etc., and faculties in between. And you can have power without expertise, right? So the two are distinct, and I tried to show a way how, what few bits, how expertise is assessed, then we should try to keep them distinct, even though they come together in many individual cases. So many who have expertise also have power, but the two can fall apart. And I think that is important. I didn't understand the second point, sorry.
Okay, well, let's just ask if our colleagues want to come in on the first point first.
I think that there's a slight confusion here, and there are lots of different sorts of power. Now, there is role-based power, there's expertise-based power, there's charismatic power. You know, so frankly, I was a university vice chancellor, rector in European terms, president in American terms. I didn't feel very powerful much of the time. I was basically rushing around trying to firefight or enable other people to do what very powerful academic expertise, people with expertise and power wanted to do. So I don't think there's this simple dichotomy, expertise or power. You know, and I think it relates back to your other question, David, which was, you know, why are some places very worried about academic freedom? It's simply that academic freedom can be very powerful in terms of influential. It influences the world outside the academy. And I think that's something we have to try and preserve. And my concern about the misuse of academic freedom is when it actually damages the influence of the academy.
Any thoughts, Malika?
I would like just to maybe take a look at two key issues, and one, because when you said power, I was also looking, and I'm so sorry that we don't have the time. There are a lot of brilliant questions in the chat. But in the previous one of the questions, somebody was asking, referring to the recent text of Wendy Brown in New York Times and discussing campuses as complex locations, and opening this important question of saying, well, you know, there is also different within the classroom that we do not necessarily allow, or so to say, are open to receiving any kind of expression and opinion, and that there is a need for teachers to also keep certain authority within the classrooms. And I think that what might be also kind of useful when we are discussing these issues, in my mind, what I'm trying to do in the classroom is always kind of this differentiation between knowledge and opinions. And this is what comes into, as in several questions have asked in the chat, the issues of academic integrity, the methodological soundness. So this is what we are doing at the university within the classroom, trying to advance knowledge that it actually does not stay at the level of opinions, and it's really embedded in certain standards that we have accepted as a scholarly community. And I think this kind of differentiation might also help us to kind of understand a lot of different issues that have been already discussed, because I would be open to a scholar discussing maybe outside of the most direct area of expertise, as it's embedded, if it's embedded in knowledge and not in opinion as such. But regarding the power, I do think that there is also, of course, Julius has said there are many different aspects of power, and they're not necessarily related just to the formal hierarchies, especially in academia, and especially regarding academic freedom. What is important to look into is this relationship between academic freedom and what Miranda Fricker has coined as the concept of epistemic injustices, and how our own identity and positions within the society also puts us in different positions of being even able to exercise the right to academic freedom. And this is, I think, where the crucial play about academic freedom within the hierarchies of higher education actually play the most important role, and then, of course, spill over or reflect the societal inequalities.
I want to come to a question now from Daniela. Why aren't academic integrity standards enough to frame academic freedom and draw the line between fair critique and academic freedom? Now, I guess there's an implicit assumption there that there's a single thing called, or a single set of things called academic integrity standards. I was going to use the word integrity in my summing up, but what are your thoughts about that?
So may I say something on that?
Of course.
Is it directly related to my presentation? So usually academic integrity, as I know it, talks about plagiarism, and that you make up data. What is it? Plagiarism, fabrication, and falsification. So the three principles of academic integrity. In addition to the scholarly standards, how the methods are that you, how probably to do an interview, how probably to collect data, etc., etc. So scientific methodology, whether it's humanities, social science, and natural sciences, big thing, very important. But integrity comes on top, so to say, as one dimension of research ethics. Another dimension is certainly that you shouldn't harm any humans. And there it gets difficult, right? Because harming, what does that mean? Am I harmed in my identity if someone is making a racist comment? I am harmed in my identity if someone making a racist comment, right? So there it's getting difficult. But I also want to say something on, because we need to define the harm. I also want to say something on why integrity is, and maybe the method added, and the research ethics about harming added as well. It's still not sufficient. Why? Science, we have seen that during the pandemic, is never just having certainty. So Milica, I agree fully with you. It's a major task every day in the classroom and in each and every publication, in each and every scholarly communication, to make it clear the difference between opinion and knowledge. The problem with knowledge is that some then think as if these were two extremes, but knowledge is never certain. That was one of the starting points of John Stuart Mill in his famous kind of famous defense of academic freedom, that disagreement is important because we are fallible. The next day we might learn that we were wrong about that vaccine or that claim about COVID or whatever it is. And everyone within the scholarly community, I think, who has gone through the kind of learning also the modesty in it, knows that one is fallible and that there will be disagreement. Now, a scholarly ethos, the ethos of scholarly arguing, is one that appreciates disagreement, but it doesn't appreciate disagreement for the sake of disagreement, or disagreement that is kind of parochial or biased in a certain sense, or partisan word Milica used, or and it cares for how you disagree. And one of the lines I made is disagree with arguments. Really not just saying this is wrong, but why is it wrong? I, for instance, in teaching about whether race exists or whether sex exists, because I'm doing philosophy of theology, these are two standard topics. I do show the students what a racist would have to show in order to be right. And they appreciate that, right? I make it clear that so far the scholarly community has clearly shown that these beliefs are wrong. But John Stuart Mill, you all know, you need to tell the students why these claims are wrong. Argumentation is the key to everything in that sense, and not that knowledge is certain, and that this is one extreme from opinion, so to say. And that is often forgotten, and it stands behind a lot of the, how can I say, if scientists get across to the public and say, I have the truth, right? That might be the wrong message as well. And wrong in the sense that you get a lot of mistrust if you overstate the claims that a scientist or a scholar can make. And yeah, so that might explain kind of, David, now I understand the second point you made, why people are worried about academic freedom. They're worried maybe of people overstating things a little bit. And then they have been wrong, and then the trust is lost, etc.
I can just follow up. I completely agree with what Maria said, but I think this is somewhere where actually the universities are failing our students, because we're not, by and large, helping them through that process of understanding what knowledge is and why knowledge is uncertain. And that goes back to my comment earlier on about safe spaces, that actually many of our students now do need safe spaces, but the institutions should be actively managing those safe spaces, because we wouldn't throw our own children out into the street, into a main road, without going down a quiet alley first of all. You know, we wouldn't throw our PhD students in front of an international conference without taking them to a poster presentation first of all. Yeah. So we shouldn't be throwing young people who come from very narrow backgrounds and maybe have very fixed views about the world into the hurly-burly of a discussion that they might find deeply, deeply difficult. But how many universities are putting all their students through a course in epistemology, first of all? What's that? None of us, or very few of us. And I think there's some interesting comments Borut has pointed out about ethics and education. And I think it goes back to the point David was making about, you know, it's about academic professionalism. It's about discussions about ethics and education. I think it's another whole topic for a debate. And actually saying there's a two-way process here. Universities have to be mindful of the external world, but the external world has to be mindful of the value of having universities where occasionally things might spill over a bit and there'd be difficult discussions. And again, I'm very mindful in part of the world, that's exactly what the ruling class doesn't want. But I think there's a question here for me about how universities in the modern era can help many of our students who don't have the common understanding that universities were based upon.
I want to stick with that point, Julius, and I want to bring in one or two other questions. And then I want to come to each of you for, let me call them final reflections, but I don't think for a minute they're going to be final reflections, because this topic is not going to be finalized anytime soon. Can I thank everybody for the quality and the thoughtfulness of the questions which have been coming through. And the one I want to draw on now is from MW, who says it also concerns me that there's so much talk about lines, while many terms are being used without being defined properly before they're being used. And what I want to add to that question is the cultural and the sort of political environment piece about universities being in very different situations, operating in different cultures, and with very different consequences if they exercise academic freedom beyond a line, wherever a line is. I'll illustrate with a short anecdote before I come to you. I was once interviewing for a professor, and I asked the question, what do you understand by academic integrity? And that professor told me the case of how she was called into her rector's office. I won't name the country. And she was threatened with a reference to the law and possible prison if she did not withdraw a remark which she had made in a paper. And it was a paper in an area of health. And I asked her what she did. And she said, well, I told them that I had checked my facts were true, and that it was my honest duty to report what I found. And the upshot was difficult initially, but happy in the end. And that lady is now a leading professor in a particular region of the world, and demonstrated to me beyond doubt that she had academic integrity. But the question I just want you to reflect on is, what would you say to academics in parts of the world where there isn't the maturity of understanding about the benefit of academic freedom that we mostly enjoy across, let me just call it the Western world? Julius, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. Do you want me to comment both to that and on the comment
Yes.
about lines and boundaries?
Yeah.
I think the most difficult is what we live a very privileged life in the liberal democratic West, whatever we tend to think. Just look at other parts of the world at the moment. And I think it's very difficult. I've worked in other parts of the world where you've had to be very careful about what you might say or do. Otherwise, you might be put on a plane and thrown out. And I'm near that happening to me. So I think all we can do is support academics in those parts of the world so that when they do go over the line and get into trouble, we defend them and support them. And we encourage them to get as close to that line as possible to demonstrate the value to their leaders of having, open debate within the institution. I don't think there's much more, unfortunately, that we can do than that, other than have debates like this and show that actually it is the benefit of society to have open debate. Just a little bit about lines and boundaries. There's a book just been published by Nick Enfield, who's the professor of linguistics in Sydney, called Language versus Reality: Why Language is Good for Lawyers and Bad for Scientists. And he makes the point, actually, the way language is structured, the way we use language. Language is not actually about describing reality. Language is about making connections, influencing people. There are some linguistics who claim that the first function of language was to lie, was to deceive. So we are stuck in a format here where we're trying to get some points across very quickly. And if we had to define every single term, one, it would get very boring, and two, it would take forever. So apologies to those of you who want every term defined and every boundary defined, but there are some limitations to what we can do. I do think that that's also, though, highlight some of the problems. There are lines, and those lines are different to different people, and there are boundaries which are different to define. But if you want my final word, it is that I think the academic institution, academics are wonderful people with lots of expertise in areas I'm always jealous of, because I'd like to have expertise in that area, and we should exploit it as much as possible, and they should be using their expertise as broadly and as widely as possible. And we should be getting academics to cross boundaries and to work with other disciplines, because we get more that way. So absolutely push back against those people who are commenting that we're saying people should just be in stovepipes. That's not what we're saying. But I think what I'm saying is we should ask people to be honest.
Yeah, thanks.
And if there's a carve out for academics, it's because they have specific expertise. And therefore, it's the same carve out as for someone who may have that expertise, but is not an academic. I don't see why having a particular type of contract with a particular type of institution should give me special rights and special rights in the world. But I do think that expertise is very important. And actually, I think the establishment of institutions where those people are brought together and supported and helped is also very special.
Thanks very much. Maria, your final thoughts.
Final thoughts. Okay, good. I prepared now to say something on the lines as well, but I can be brief on that. And it might be my final line. We shouldn't be afraid of lines. People are now, because they translate it to the notion of boundary. If you draw a line, you draw a boundary. In a certain way, that's true. But look, you might have seen that kind of color spectrum, right? And you can have, there is green and there's yellow. So you draw a line between green and yellow. And why do you draw a line between green and yellow? It helps you in digesting the world and kind of ordering quickly. And then you notice, oh, actually, there are kinds of colors that are quite in between. They're at the border, so to say. Yeah, no problem. We can appreciate these and nonetheless appreciate the knowledge that there's a difference between green and yellow. So drawing a line means that you make a distinction, meaning that you make the word actually richer, because you not just say there are colors, but you say there are colors of different kinds, yellow and green, and then you might go further and you have 5 different shades between green and yellow. And that helps. It's actually a richer color picture, right? And so dividing or drawing a line is not necessarily excluding things. It's just making it more structured. That's at least what I believe in, what's helpful in making distinctions and distinguishing between different things without having to make a hierarchy between them. And towards those who have never had the opportunity of appreciating the freedom that we call freedom of expression and academic freedom, I would have to know much more about why they don't have that, and maybe there might be personal things, and then you can help them appreciating. Maybe if they don't appreciate it, it might be tougher, but sometimes they would appreciate it if they would have experienced it once, if you can show them that they can experience it, and the pleasure in disagreeing in a respectful and scholarly manner.
Thank you very much. Elika.
Thank you. Well, maybe just a couple of points, and out of the importance of also understanding the creation of knowledge as a global endeavor, as much as certainly there are differences related to consequences in infringements on academic freedom. Unfortunately, within what we call the Western democratic world, we are also witnessing a number of very worrying phenomena. I would only refer to the whole situation in France, where the minister was directly referring to the Islamo-Gauchisme and criticizing the whole scholarly community for advancing and trying to understand specific social phenomena in the reality, and even going as far as inviting for special commissions to look into the work of scholars, whether exactly they are political activists or scholars. And I think these kind of governmental initiatives are very concerning and very worrying for the academic freedom. So unfortunately, this is not only a specificity of non-Western regions. Also, an important element that maybe wasn't sufficiently touched upon in this discussion, and it relates to the fact of different types of infringements on academic freedom, is something that we might call the economy of academic freedom. And that is in the Western world exactly this question of precarization of researchers and scholars, and the depletion and lowering of public funding to research. Because we might ask ourselves that on one side, of course, academic freedom refers to expressing the knowledge that we have established through our scholarly work, but it's also choosing the topics that we wish to research. And if we are fully dependent only upon project private funding, we are not fully free in deciding which topics deserve our further research questions. And then just going back to this question of limits and boundaries that Maria and Judith were already kind of looking into. And I think maybe what is the most complex challenge is exactly to kind of transmit this issue that, yes, of course, knowledge is not a dogma. It's not only an expertise, it has a wider element in it. Jens was just mentioning in the comments the question of wisdom also entering, and I think it's an interesting point of view to reflect upon. But as scholars, we do attempt on finding where the limits and lines are, and at the same time immediately continuously challenging ourselves within where do we see these limits. And I think these ambiguities and ambivalences, and also, as it has been said, not sufficiently being clear on what we mean, this is the chaotic process, I would say, of creation of knowledge. And there is a challenge in exactly transmitting this into wider audiences, sometimes asking for more kind of dogmatic and final-ended answers to the questions of the world, while our task is to continuously open new questions. And I think this is the important specificity of academic freedom and how it translates in our endeavors.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you to Julius and Maria and to you for what has been a really thoughtful and considered approach to this topic. I have to tell you that originally we had planned to do a seminar like this about a year earlier, and it's actually been on the too difficult heap. Different angles were considered and so on, but we wanted to do something that would be helpful. I have to say, I am really grateful and really glad that we actually waited, because to have you three contributing from your different perspectives has been very rich indeed. I apologize for letting this go slightly over time. I'm not going to do a long summing up. The words which come to my mind, which I take from this, are the need for integrity, the need for openness and transparency, and the need never to forget the fundamental purposes of higher education in inspiring what we're doing in serving society. Now, in addition to thanking our speakers, I'd also like to thank Carla and Mary Beth, who have been working behind the scenes to enable this to happen. And also to thank the supporters of the Magna Carta Observatory. They're listed on page 15 of the programme. Without their generosity, we would not be able to exist or to run programmes like this. I'd like to thank everybody who's participated, especially for the thoughtful questions, and we will look through those afterwards and see what we might take up in other forums. If you would be kind enough to complete the feedback form, which is in the background particulars, that would be very helpful to us. And please do use it as an opportunity to guide our efforts in the future. If you come from an institution which has not yet signed the Magna Carta and think you might like to do so, details of how to do it are in the pack, and the deadline for the next round of considerations, there will be others, but the deadline for the next round is the 30th of June this year. Looking ahead, keep your diaries clear, please, for the 14th to the 16th of September, our anniversary conference in Bologna. And you've already seen today one of the contributors to that, Melika, who will be with us in Bologna and helping us with that event. What we're going to focus on there is universities engaging with society in turbulent times. We have a number of contributors from areas which have encountered difficulties in the world, Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and we think that's going to be a very rich and practically focused event. The recording of this event will be available online. You can get to it through the Magna Carta website. Please do share it with your colleagues. And there will be other resources there, including one which Julius has been involved in authoring for the Leadership Foundation. If we were meeting in person, I would at this point wish you a safe journey home, because you are probably taking part from your home. Can I wish you a safe journey onwards? A safe journey onwards in your academic journey. And I hope that some of the things that we've discussed today will be helpful to you and your universities. So thank you everybody for contributing today. Thank you.